Policing the election process has never been more of a challenge than it is today. Disinformation, as we discussed yesterday, is rampant. Threats against election workers and candidates have been roiling America's political system well before the assassination attempt on former President Trump just a few weeks ago. Attorney General Dana Nessel is in the middle of it all. Michigan is one of 4 states to have pursued criminal charges against fake electors following the 2020 election, while also prosecuting the case related to the stunning attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer. Before being sworn in as Michigan's 54th Attorney General, Attorney General Nessel served as a local prosecutor for more than a decade. As a civil rights lawyer prior to public service, she was the lead counsel and a precursor to the landmark Supreme Court ruling that codified same-sex marriage and granted adoption rights to same-sex couples. We're fortunate to have Attorney General Nessel with us today at this most consequential time. So please welcome Attorney General Nessel.
Whoa. All right, that feels like it's not supposed to happen. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this good? All right, fantastic. It's great to be here today. It's great to be here. It's great to have you all here. I have a prepared speech to read to you all today, and the reason for that is that when I don't, sometimes I tend to spontaneously talk about my love of drag queens. So I'm going to try not to do that today, although on Saturday I went with Senator Jeremy Moss, who I think is your next speaker, I want to say, to Royal Oak Pride, where Bianca was the featured act, who, if you know, won RuPaul's Drag Race for the 6th season, and she was amazing. So you can print that any place you want. I stand by it. All right, well, so I am really happy to be here because I'm excited, I'm heartened to see that the craft of journalism is still alive and well in the United States of America. And of course, shout out to the Michigan reporters that are part of this year's cohort. Malachi Barrett, you're here somewhere, right? Yeah, okay. Sorry, say again? It's Malachi. Malachi, sorry. My apologies for the mispronunciation. Unlike some people, I recognize they don't always pronounce people's names right, and I feel bad when I do it. And I try to be better. Joey Capoletti? All right, did I pronounce your name right? Thank God, jeez. Danielle James, is that correct? Oh, see, now that would have been really bad for me. So thank goodness. Anyway, I read your work even if I don't always get your names right, and I think that you should all be proud of your staunch defense that you've mounted these past several years in these very bizarre times. We're preserving the integrity of our nation's free press, even in the face of shifting public opinion about the press. But personally, I will just speak for myself. I am very grateful for your efforts, and I hope that you'll all feel the same support here in your hometown communities as well. So the press, I think it goes without saying, plays a very vital role in the commission of government services with several responsibilities. Among them, you serve as a watchdog to dredge up and illuminate any issues that transpire, but you also serve as a gateway of communication between public officials and the communities they serve that we leverage to publicize our programs, our initiatives, the things that are going on in the state. And I always say, we can have the greatest programs in the world that your government can offer, but they're not very helpful if you don't know about them. And you are a means for people to know what's going on with the government, the bad, but also the very good things that sometimes government does. And, I visited every corner of the state of Michigan, and I talk with local advocates about a million different issues. And I often hear the same refrain, why don't we know about this? Why didn't we hear about this program? And, again, our statewide services don't mean anything. People don't know about them and can't utilize them. What makes it particularly difficult in Michigan is a very big state, as you know. I'll go up to the western UP, or I'll go down to the southern border of our state, and sometimes you have different media markets that are not Michigan media markets at all. And when I go to those places, it's really difficult for people to know and to understand the things that we're doing in Michigan, because they're not getting Michigan information, which makes that a little bit difficult. So it really sort of, for me, underscores the importance of people getting information and accurate information about the governments that serve them. And I'd like to sort of start today by saying how grateful I am to our partners in the media who, like us, are committed to spreading accurate and truthful information in an election season about candidates and about our elections. So years ago, I read this book. I want to say it was called So Many Enemies, So Little Time. Yes, thanks, Mel. And anyway, but he was about a Fulbright scholar who had traveled to Kyrgyzstan, which was, I can't tell you that I knew much about Kyrgyzstan before I read this book, but did anybody read that book? No, you should. Okay, it's a really good book. I highly recommend it. Anyway, so she's a Fulbright scholar. In the early 2000s, she goes to Kyrgyzstan, which is in Central Asia, and it was one of the sort of, it was part of the USSR, and then when those sort of satellite countries were sort of cast aside, we always hear about the countries that were happy to be sort of liberated from the Soviet Union, but we don't really hear about the countries that weren't so happy about it, that were happy to be part of the USSR because of a lot of different services that were provided by the Soviet government. But anyway, it was about her experiences in teaching journalism to young students, and how difficult it was, because these were people who were not familiar with the free press at all, and were sort of starting from scratch and starting from ground zero, and didn't really know what it was like to, have critical thoughts and writings about the people who served in their government. And it almost never even occurred to them that that was something that they could do, because they couldn't before, and they didn't know how to do it. So they didn't really have any inclination to sort of probe the issues and report the findings to the public. And one of the things that this author wrote about was, she said, public anger, after all, is a certain responsibility. And in Kyrgyzstan, people had been made too powerless by history, by what they had been taught, as much as what has actually happened, to feel comfortable carrying that burden. And it is a burden. It's a heavy responsibility to figure out exactly what's going wrong and to make sure everybody knows about it, so that you can begin to find solutions to the problem. And I'd say doubly so if you are reporting for a population that's too disillusioned to address their problems, even if they're brought to light. And a population who dismisses your reporting as fake news, when most of them only read the headline, if that, makes it particularly complex. One of the things that FDR said was, freedom of conscience, of education, of speech, of assembly are among the very fundamentals of democracy, and all of them would be nullified should freedom of the press ever be successfully challenged. And so, in other words, freedom of the press is often the very first thing to go when a nation descends into authoritarianism. Our democracy just simply cannot exist without the free press, as you know. And attacks against journalists are on the rise globally. In 2023, the Committee to Protect Journalists reported that there were 320 journalists in prison because of their work, and that's down from a record-breaking 367 in 2022. And what we know is if a country is willing to imprison their journalists, they're unlikely to take issue with the imprisonment of protesters or elected political opponents. And we know it's a slippery slope. It begins with suppression of the media. Is it just me, or like, do you think this is gonna explode at like any moment? All right, is that better? Can you hear me? Yeah. Good, okay, let's do that, if that's okay with you. Anyway, ultimately I would say we all end up in the same place, right? We are all targets, potentially, of an autocratic regime that could really fundamentally change things in America, which is what we've seen elsewhere. Censorship would undoubtedly affect our ability to function as public officials, much the same as it would affect the press corps' ability to fairly and impartially cover the news. Did you guys see the list that was published of some ally of the Trump organization, and it had a whole list of individuals? Some of them were elected officials, but it also had a list of the media that were to be targeted in the event that Trump is reelected. Did you guys report on it? Did you see it? Okay. Yeah, about 350 people on it. You know, I was really concerned for many different reasons, but of course, out of curiosity, I tracked it down. And just, as it turned out, the Secretary of State Jocelyn Benz was on it, and Governor Gretchen Whitmer was on it, but not me. And so I was like, that's amazing, good news for me. But also, I don't know, I was like, am I not important enough to make this list? And then I felt like a little bad about myself. But there were a number of news organizations on that list, and I was waiting for Donald Trump to disavow that list, but he never did. So scary times. You might have heard it said during election season that your vote is the key which unlocks your access to every other right, and it is a fact. We can't have environmental protections or smooth roads or anti-discrimination laws or any of that unless we elect like-minded representatives to implement these measures for us. But if you zoom out a little bit further, an informed voter really has to get their information from somewhere. And how do you discern a person's values, or check their voting record, or compare their background with that of other candidates if no one's reporting on it? You really can't. And without the agency to do research on the election, what is the point of voting at all? Civic engagement is really a hollow consolation prize when there's nothing to engage with, and that's why I'm so honored to participate in this dialogue with all of you today, to lay a foundation as we as public officials and you as journalists work together in the upcoming election season to provide accurate, timely, and insightful coverage for voters all around the country. And of course, I'm also thrilled that the National Press Foundation chose to host this iteration of their Elections Journalism Fellowship Conference here in the great state of Michigan. And for you out-of-towners, welcome to Detroit. It's my personal opinion that Michigan is the perfect venue for your conference this year, not only because the road to the White House cuts clear through Michigan and our 15 electoral votes. You know, and if you didn't think Michigan was important, then all you should do is pay attention to the number of times that presidential candidates and their running mates come to the state of Michigan. Obviously, they think it's important, and from an electoral map standpoint, obviously it is. But Michigan's also a great place to host this conference because there's just no state that's more beautiful during election season. You know, we're glad that you're here and not in Ohio. By the way, I just have to mention this off script. I don't pretend to know why the Republicans do what they do exactly, but I don't know what the mentality was in thinking that you should get an Ohio State Buckeye to help win Michigan, because let me tell you, that's not how it works around here. So if anything, people are going to vote against the Republican Party just because you have a Buckeye on the ticket. But so maybe not the best decision, but again, I have no control or say over how they select their vice presidential candidates. But anyway, Michigan really is a good state to study for the preparation of the 2024 election, because our election officials really have been put through the proverbial ringer in the decade or so since the 2020 election. Just about every election-denying scheme or stunt that gained national attention in the past 4 years was attempted at some point here in Michigan. So whether it was delays in the counting of absentee ballots, or robocalls spreading misinformation, or frivolous lawsuits seeking to overturn the will of the voters, we've really seen it all here. As you know, before insurrectionists stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th of 2021, armed gunmen stormed the Michigan Capitol on August 30th of 2020. So they really staged their dress rehearsal in Michigan because they knew it was a good laboratory for their experimentation and to sort of probe the kind of reception they'd get on a national level. And many of those people, by the way, who were at the Michigan Capitol were also there at the United States Capitol. This is the ultimate swing state, and it's really a microcosm of America. And our public officials have been bolstering our state's defenses and trying to close loopholes in the law as they're identified. And actually, I think it's great that you're having Senator Moss and then Secretary Benson here because they can elaborate more on those efforts. But one example in the news cycle, the Michigan legislature introduced a law to regulate the use of artificial intelligence in campaign ads. And that's just one of many reforms that we've made. And we've essentially been training for the 2024 election really for our entire tenure in office. So, we're trying to be as ready as we possibly can be to take on whatever's thrown at us next. But one thing that I learned in 2020, and this has sort of been further cemented as a universal truth regarding modern presidential elections, going off the chaos that's already transpired, you have to expect the unexpected at all times. And so flexibility really is the name of the game. My staff and I have resigned ourselves to the task of just dousing fires everywhere for months on end until all the votes have been cast and the results are certified. But we could prepare a million individual contingency plans, and there still be emergency circumstances to address and game time decisions that we're going to have to make. And we knew this really even going into 2020, and that's why, for example, I make it a point to have a war room ready on Election Day in case of emergencies, and we've implemented many such procedures for our department in collaboration with local law enforcement, with our state and federal partners. We have a plan, and that plan has been beefed up in the last 4 years to incorporate lessons learned both from 2020 and from 2022. So I'm not going to claim to be able to anticipate exactly what will happen in the 100 or so days now between now and the election or in the aftermath of it, all the way up, honestly, until whoever our new president is getting sworn into office. But I can tell you in broad strokes what our perspective is heading into election season, and that's at the Michigan Department of Attorney General. We have our eyes on this election, and we know that you do too. So first and foremost, we're working to ensure the immediate physical safety of all voters and election workers who'll be visiting their polling places or making use of ballot drop boxes in the coming election season. And my department has communicated with local, state, federal law enforcement agencies in the previous elections since I've been in office, and again in preparation for this year's elections, to shore up our emergency response plans. And after months of meetings and sharing information and expertise, our agents spend Election Day monitoring and, if necessary, responding to disturbances at voting sites or counting boards statewide in order to ensure a safe and secure election. And in 2024, with the implementation of Proposition 2 here, our plans were reworked to account for the 9 days of early voting, which are currently ongoing. And residents can report suspicious activity at polling locations. And we have a hotline number that they can call in case you want to report on it, 517-335-0800. and that number is listed on our website. And it's going to be publicized further by the state of Michigan on social media accounts as we draw close to the election. I'm sure many other states have similar systems as well. And of course, I encourage all of you to include state resources like your tip line in your election stories. We also have at my department a hate crimes and domestic terrorism unit, which takes on its fair share of cases to protect the safety of election workers. And just this fall, my department secured a conviction against a man who issued death threats against Governor Whitmer and Secretary Benson. We do this a lot, unfortunately. We've prosecuted countless threats against judges, legislators, sheriffs, prosecutors, nonpartisan board members, members of health departments. Many of those we don't even publicize because of the wishes of those particular afflicted officials who don't want more attention on it. But suffice it to say that these investigations are happening almost constantly, and there are a lot more cases than you might think. The bottom line is that my department takes these cases very seriously, and that we will not hesitate to prosecute credible threats when the evidence supports it. Residents, of course, are free to disagree with their public officials. They can express their disagreement in any number of ways. They can visit them and challenge them at their coffee hours. They can mount a recall election. They can find somebody to primary them in the next election cycle. But you know what? People are not permitted to threaten a person's life or their family's life. I mean, we draw the line, obviously. And the risk of violence is just, it's really unfortunate. It's driving away good candidates and good officials out of these positions and discouraging potential leaders from stepping up to fill those spots. According to the Bipartisan Policy Center, 2024 will be the first time administering a presidential election for almost 2/3 of our nation's election officials. That's insane. It's not going to improve until we make it a point to protect the people who protect our democracy all around the country. Now, our legislature here passed a few measures to enhance the protections election workers enjoy under Michigan law, and my hate crimes and domestic terrorism unit vows to enforce those vigorously as necessary throughout the election season and also beyond it. In addition to public safety, the next big concern my department has when it comes to election security is the spread of misinformation and disinformation. You know, this being a tactic that we see used by our foreign adversaries, and also domestic adversaries of democracy who benefit from the chaos and undermining citizens' trust of democracy and intentionally spreading false information about elections that gets picked up and amplified, often by well-meaning people who just don't know what to believe. The worst form of misinformation, in my opinion, involves a false time or place or manner of voting so that it discourages or makes it impossible for people to vote on or before Election Day. And back in 2020, I was the first state AG to issue charges against Jack Berkman and Jacob Wohl for allegedly orchestrating a series of robocalls aimed at suppressing the vote of the predominantly black electorate in Detroit in the 2020 general election by promoting falsehoods about absentee voting, which was particularly detrimental because it was the first time in Michigan that we had no reason absentee voting, so many people didn't know how to do it in the first place. And of course, it was in the middle of a pandemic, and when are you most likely to want to vote absentee instead of in person, but during a pandemic? So, that was particularly concerning, but, we sent our agents out to California to execute search warrants, which they did, and we collaborated with the AG's offices in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, all of which reported similar robocalls being made to their state residents. who lived in areas that had high concentrations of black voters. It's believed that about 85,000 calls were made nationally. Now, it's always been a crime here in Michigan to knowingly spread false information about, again, time, place, manner of elections so that eligible voters are discouraged or prevented from casting their ballot. And I'm happy to say the Michigan Supreme Court just ruled in June to uphold the state statute that outlaws voter intimidation, specifically in regard to the Berkman-Wohl case. But that was a pretty egregious example of a coordinated misinformation campaign. Oftentimes it's really just sort of a lot simpler. It's something that's printed without being fact-checked, or a social media post that gets buried somewhere in your feed. We've had some success in the 2020 election cycle getting false information taken down from social media, but unfortunately a lot has changed since that time, especially in terms of the number of people who are involved from these platforms who work on coordinating with with government agencies in terms of removing false information. In fact, there's a pretty major social platform that was purchased since that time by a particular person who himself likes to share misinformation and disinformation. And that's really concerning. That is a problem. But it's why your job is all the more important, so that you are out there spreading accurate information to counter the false information. And, we appreciate you using your platform to be louder than ever, calling out the incessant falsehoods that will certainly flood the discourse in the coming months, and to let voters know to check, in the case of Michigan, michigan.gov/vote for accurate information about their voter registration, polling location, and their ballots. So let's say that we've made it through this campaign season. It's the day after the election. We can finally wipe our hands clean of the 2024 election and get back to business as usual, right? Does anybody think that's going to happen? Yeah. In another life, maybe that would have been true, actually. But in a post-2020 America, our work does not end when the polls close or when the votes are counted. And arguably, our most important responsibility is to see, of course, not just that every eligible ballot is counted and that the will of the voters is upheld, but I remember personally in the 2020 election, of all things, we ended up having to sue the United States Postal Service for, Postmaster General DeJoy and his work to disenfranchise absentee ballot voters. And I remember having to go myself with a court order in my hand to distribution centers, both in Pontiac and Detroit, and to run around those facilities trying to find absentee ballots that had not yet been delivered to the clerk. I did it the day before the election. And there were, dozens and dozens and dozens of ballots that needed to be delivered. But worse, it wasn't to me. What was more upsetting than the ballots that had to be delivered that already had been completed, that were on their way to a clerk, were all the ballots that were still on their way to a voter, some of which had been postmarked a month earlier. And all I could think about is all those people who never got the opportunity to vote because we had a Postmaster General, who I'm sure working in coordination with the then president, intentionally made it difficult for people to vote. And some of those people, no doubt, probably went in and cast a ballot in person because they never received their ballot, but many of these people were out of state. You could tell from the addresses. And they had, requested a ballot, and they never received that ballot. And I imagine there's going to be further efforts to disenfranchise people. We know that. Even, of course, in 2020 here in the state of Michigan, where you had one candidate who received approximately 154,000 more votes than another candidate, a presidential candidate. Obviously, still a point of contention. Had a lawsuit that we had to defend that was filed by the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who led a coalition of AGs in a lawsuit to overturn our lawful election here in Michigan, as well as in Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. We held strong to our convictions, and we did not permit their frivolous efforts to upend democracy, but we did have to spend a significant amount of our precious limited state resources fighting back against a torrential downpour of frivolous lawsuits that followed the 2020 election. And a little bit note on that is, and this is a particular concern for me that I've talked about, because there were a number of attorneys that were involved in that effort. They were sanctioned, most of them, by a district court judge that was upheld by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. At one point, they were filing so many appeals that the Sixth Circuit said, no more appeals for you. You can't file any more paperwork in regard to that. Just pay the money. But I think one of the things that bothers me so much is they're all still practicing. Nothing happened to them. Nothing happened to their law licenses. And, many of them are still in the process of being engaged in filing frivolous lawsuits. And I think we're going to continue to see many of those bad actors play a role in the 2024 election. I personally filed a grievance on behalf of myself and the Secretary of State and the governor against Sidney Powell in Texas. Does anybody know what happened to my grievance against Sidney Powell when she tried to undermine our democracy here in Michigan? Anybody know what happened to that? I'll tell you, nothing. Absolutely nothing. Do you know what the Texas Attorney Grievance Commission did with that complaint? Nothing. When I say nothing, I mean certainly not a revocation of her law license, not a suspension, not a fine, not a reprimand, not a slap on the hand, absolutely nothing. Now, let's take that, let's extrapolate that, and let's compare it to, let's say you had a doctor, right? Somebody who was a licensed physician who performed surgeries on people, and they did something, whether it was intentionally or accidental, but they ended up seriously harming a patient because of whatever their methods were that they utilized. Could you imagine a regulatory agency saying, we are going to wait and see if you get convicted of a crime, not just a crime, a felony, and only then will we consider any disciplinary action to your professional license? But that's what we're seeing in the state of Michigan, and with some of our Michigan bad actors that are attorneys that were involved in the effort to undermine the 2020 election. Many of them have been charged with crimes. I will give you a few examples. One is somebody by the name of Stefanie Lambert. And she's been charged, and yet her license is still active. There have been no repercussions to her at all, even though she's awaiting trial in a couple of different cases involving election-related crimes. My former opponent, Matthew DePerno, who ran against me in the 2022 election, he is very famously, you might remember, involved in the Antrim County lawsuit. He right now is facing charges in Oakland County for malfeasance involving, crimes involving the election. And yet he is free to practice law. In fact, he is now a candidate for Michigan Supreme Court. So that's what happens when you have absolutely no disciplinary action at all whatsoever against an attorney's license. And again, could you even imagine if this was a physician or some other type of licensed professional who was permitted to, take advantage of their professional license to hurt the public in some way without any repercussions for years and years and years. Does your standing mean you want me to cut this off? I'm trying to figure out, like... Sometimes I see that.
Not at all, but...
Okay.
But I know that we've got an
Yeah.
anxious group who'd love to ask
Sure.
you questions.
You bet. I can cut off all of the rest of this. There's nothing about drag queens at all, which makes it just incredibly boring. So...
Your remarks are great, and one of the things that, as you mentioned earlier, these folks have come and have lots of questions about your work and what you've done here and what the landscape looks like. And,
Sure.
And if you're okay with moving to Q&A.
I had some more FDR quotes. Can I just...
You can mix those in with your with the answer.
And I was hoping to mispronounce the names of a few more reporters
We
before I
can
finish.
certainly do
Okay.
that. We
All
can
right.
certainly do that.
Happy to answer questions. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for coming. My name is Josh Meyer from USA Today. I brought this article partially to show Kevin, my former colleague, but this is an article about how some of these militia groups have been threatening law enforcement officials and public officials for months. And it's actually from 1995, which shows, I guess, how old I am. It was before Oklahoma City. And so I wanted to ask you about those. A lot of these groups are from Michigan, the Michigan militia. They were involved in the 2020, whatever you want to call it, at the Capitol. Can you talk more about that? Like, you guys have been at the forefront of investigating these groups, but I know that there's civil liberties and freedom of speech and open carry issues. I mean, can you just talk about the challenges and what you're finding in terms of militia groups in the state and what they might be trying to do for during the election?
Yeah, so we've tried to keep a careful eye in, again, working in relationship with our local partners, Michigan State Police, with the federal authorities. And, so we have these regular conversations to identify any threats that we possibly can. And then we are engaged and we're active in terms of when there is the evidence to do so, to make sure that those individuals are charged. But there's sort of a fine line, right, between exactly what constitutes illegal threatening behavior and a credible threat versus things that are just kind of like will freak you out a little bit, and an election official would have every reason to believe that something seems menacing to them, but it doesn't necessarily violate the law. And that's sometimes the gray area that we find ourselves in. But when we do identify, again, credible threats that we can pursue, we absolutely issue those charges. And of course, the Michigan legislature here, enhanced those penalties. Sometimes we end up charging actual just terrorism, a 20-year offense. And we're not afraid to do that if the evidence can sustain a charge and a conviction. So, the thing that we've tried to convey to election workers, and we do have regular meetings with all the clerks in the state of Michigan, to let them know exactly, what behavior constitutes a crime, but also who to contact. And we also are involved in trainings that we do with all law enforcement officials. So we sort of run these, war games, I guess you would call it, and we try to envision every scenario that we possibly can. Obviously, there are some things that we're not going to think of. And I'm going to concede this to you. We did these tabletop exercises in 2020, but, false slate of electors, I did not see that coming. Like, that was not something that I contemplated happening. But, there are things that we've done to make sure that can never happen again, right? I mean, we have a law in place right now that dictates specifically how the slate of electors can be conveyed to the United States Senate. And no longer can you just, go to the basement of, the Michigan Republican headquarters and fill out some forms down there, and then take it and send it off in the post office, and have it sent, to the United States Senate, where theoretically it could be counted. I mean, we changed that. It's got to be officially transmitted through the office of the governor now. The end. So you try to find things that were a problem, you try to change those things. We've done similar things in terms of what if there's a problem with the Board of Canvassers and they fail to certify, not because all the requirements haven't been met, but because they think something fishy is afoot. Something that, again, is not within their bailiwick. It's not within their purview. It's not within their mandate as to what they can or can't do serving on the Board of Canvassers. Well, now we've cured that. Those challenges, at least when it pertains to the president or vice president, it has to go directly to the Michigan Supreme Court. So, we've tried to take issues that we've spotted and to change those things. But in terms of, these threats, all I can say is that we take them very seriously. We work very hard to investigate those cases, and we absolutely charge those cases when we have the evidence to do so. And that's the message that we always try to send to all the election workers.
Hi, Taylor Goldenstein with the Houston Chronicle. I just had a question about the lawyer discipline you were talking about. Do you see any solutions to addressing this nationally, or do you think because every state has their own bar association, it would be too difficult to kind of regulate that nationally?
Yeah, I can't understand why we have not taken greater efforts to make sure that we are holding people accountable. Again, when, they really, we, as lawyers, we have to take an oath. I don't know if you guys know that, but we take an oath to uphold the Constitution. And we also take an oath, you're not supposed to be intentionally submitting to a court of law information that you know is false. And furthermore, the expectation is if your name is on a pleading, if you filed an appearance, you're supposed to have read those pleadings. We actually saw, I think, some arguments made by some of the attorneys like, well, I didn't read it. Like, well, then maybe don't submit it to a court of law with your name on it and your bar number. But, I've talked to members of our Michigan Supreme Court about this because they sort of oversee what happens with the Attorney Grievance Commission. And what I hear sometimes is like, well, we don't have this authority, we don't have that authority. And I have to say this, attorneys abusing their professional license can lead to the downfall of democracy. That's the way that misinformation is spread. Well, a lawyer said it in a court of law. It must be true. And we know for a fact that that's not simply the case. So we have to start treating attorneys the same way we treat all other professional licensees and say that if you are intentionally utilizing your license to do something so nefarious as to undermine the integrity of an election or our democracy, then there have to be repercussions. And you shouldn't be able to continue to exploit your professional license to do that. And right, like you said, right now it is a piecemeal because it is state by state. And I will acknowledge that New York, I believe, stripped Rudy Giuliani of his law license. And there have been a few other instances. God, I think Eastman had some repercussions to his license out in California, but not here in Michigan. And so we just see the continuation of these attorneys. Again, I find it, I find it incredible. I find it implausible that, again, you in the case of my former opponent, the fact that he can have these election fraud cases that are, pending, bound over to a circuit court for trial, but that's not enough for any kind of repercussions. And again, what I have seen happen is these cases are just languishing. I can't believe how long it's taking for these cases to get to a place where they're even going to be tried. So a lot of bad things can happen between the time that you discover that an attorney has used their law license to commit, in some of these cases, an illegal act. Between then and when they go to trial can be years and years and years. I will note that in the false slate of electors case, several of those defendants that were charged are attorneys. And I just think it's dangerous when you don't have any repercussions. And if you say only if and when you have been convicted of a felony can there be any sanctions or disciplinary action at all taken against your professional license, that's dangerous. We definitely have a standard of, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in order to be convicted of a crime. But that is not the standard for, a person to be able to maintain a professional license. And I will say in my department, the AGC, the Attorney Grievance Commission, is separate, and it's lawyers are a self-governing body, a self-governing entity. So it's no surprise that we don't do a very good job of regulating our own members, right? But that's not the case in terms of, we have LARA, the licensing and regulatory agency in Michigan that oversees virtually all the other licensees. And again, if you are a physician, if you are a nurse, if you are, an accountant, if you are a massage therapist, if there is a claim that you used your license to engage in illegal activity, you can be suspended right away in some instances, but not lawyers. And so, does something need to happen? Absolutely. But because every state oversees their licensees, the most you can do, and this is what I have, I'm sorry, I'm going on for a long time about this, but the most you could do is one state could say that they're not going to permit an out-of-state attorney to practice in their state because you have to be granted permission to do that. So Michigan theoretically could say, hey, Sidney Powell, no more Michigan cases for you. And whether it's the state courts or the federal courts, they could say you can't practice here, but she still gets to practice in Texas. And all the Michigan licensees, they still get to practice here. Yes, another state could say you're not going to practice in that state, and they could turn you down because you have to be pro hoc vici, special permission. But I think it's a huge problem, and I think that the American Bar Association should be encouraging every single state to take more aggressive action in terms of how they're going to handle lawyers that commit crimes.
I got a mic over here. Hi, Malachi Barrett. Don't worry about the name thing. I've been called a lot worse. So kind of a two-parter question for you. I understand you're on a AI task force with attorneys general from around the country. I'm wondering what is rising out of that so far. What are you guys seeing? And then more specifically, I see like a glut of this kind of content on social media, and I'm wondering when does it cross the line into election interference? When does it cross from like free speech or memes? And for example, there's a lot of videos about J.D. Vance and his relationship to couches online right now. And some of it is manipulated video where I've seen deepfakes of him talking about his proclivity toward a nice leather couch. Does that cross the line? How do we deal with this when a lot of it is coming from Americans here making jokes but misleading each other in the process?
So his name, his actual name is not Vladimir Futon, as I've been led to believe. Is that? No, okay, all right. It's not, by the way, it's not, just so that's clear. No, it's a problem. Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I'm seeing those manipulated images each and every day. As I talked about, I made reference to Elon Musk earlier, right? He's sharing that stuff. Who's got more followers on X than the owner of X? So it is really concerning. Obviously, we've tried in Michigan to put some semblance of regulation in place as to that. Will we be able to enforce it fully? Probably not. Let's just be honest about it, right? These images are going to be everywhere. And so, yeah, we could find a campaign. Theoretically, if you're doing this multiple times and we can trace it to somebody, we can charge someone. If they're engaged in this as a course of behavior. But the fact is, I think we're going to have to educate the public to only look at trusted sources. First of all, you guys are going to be busy tracking that stuff down, right? And that's going to be a big part of your job, unfortunately, is to say what is true and what's not true, and to be fact-checking this stuff. And as hard as it is, right, when you have candidates out there, you know, and I will say just very candidly, I mean, I don't think that Donald Trump opens his mouth without uttering, dozens of falsehoods in every speech that he gives. And, you guys have done, a phenomenal job, I think, for the most part, of tracking that and making sure that the public knows what's truthful and what's untruthful. But unfortunately, now you're going to have to do the same exact thing with any of these videos that come out. And I wish I could tell you that I had the expectation that we could just contact, YouTube, or contact, Facebook or Meta, or contact, TikTok, and say, hey, can you take that video down? It contains falsehoods, so we think it's misleading the electorate. And we had a lot of success in that in 2020, by the way. We really did. And in fact, it was a pretty quick process because we had engaged with all of those platforms ahead of time. We had a plan, and oftentimes, it just took a single call, and we'd be like, hey, there is false information out there about, there was a flood in a particular precinct in Flint, and now if that's your precinct, you can't vote there, and you have to go someplace else or whatever. We had a lot of success getting that stuff taken down immediately. I don't know that that is going to be the case this time, and that's why we have to rely on the press more than ever to correct those falsehoods, and we have to get the public to a place where they understand, don't believe anything that you see unless it comes from these verified sources. And that could be the press, or it could be, for instance, a clerk's office, or it could be the Michigan Department of State. But I think it's just going to have to be a conversation that we have with the public about not believing everything they hear, or in the case of these deep fakes, everything that they see.
Right here. Yeah, Joey Capelletti with the Associated Press. As you've mentioned, some of these most high-profile election fraud, whatever cases after the 2020 election, whether it's Perno, Lambert, or the 15 people in the false elector case, many of them won't really see any responsibility or discipline before the 2024 election because some of these trials, are taking so long, and I know you have no control over that. But do you, I don't want to say maybe regret, but
there was a period of time, before those charges were announced. How do you, I guess, balance, really, or how did you balance, trying to move fast on those and bring charges so that these people, because now, if Trump is elected, who knows if those, electors will ever, see that responsibility. How, I guess, do you regret, I guess, at all how long it took to bring those charges, or was that necessary to, get all of that evidence? Because with the false slate, a lot of that was kind of out in the open. They're posting photos of it. So I guess what was that balance like of, gathering all the evidence, but also, wanting to move quickly on that?
Well, I think I've talked about, in terms of the false slate case, first of all, many of the cases that we just talked about are state cases, not federal cases. So when you talk about if Trump is back in office, that they won't face accountability, I would push back on that because obviously, whoever the president of the United States is, they have a lot of sway when it comes to obviously their ability to pardon people. We saw that from Trump in his last administration, where a slew of people were convicted for a variety of offenses that he pardoned. But that is not the case when it comes to state cases. He doesn't have that control. Only the governor has that ability. So I wouldn't say that just because he is back in office that those individuals will not face accountability if in fact they are elected. So I didn't handle all of these cases. Obviously the one involving my former opponent I could not handle, and so of course I had to refer that to the Prosecuting Attorneys Coordinating Council, and then they placed it with another prosecutor who then took the case. But I will say this on the false slate case, you know, I thought it was really important to refer it to the federal government and to the DOJ, because we knew that, of course, this was a coordinated effort that took place over the course of many swing states. And while, of course, charges were ultimately brought on some individuals as it pertained to these false slates, I mean, not against the individual false electors, you know, there was a period of time that went by that I had the expectation that things would happen that seemingly took a lot longer than I had hoped. And so at some point I decided to take the case back, especially after the January 6th committee, you know, all of their testimony was done obviously in a public forum in Congress. And you could really see at that point a lot of the evidence, and a lot of the evidence I think that is being used or will be used during the course of that particular case. So, you know, if I had a crystal ball back then and I knew how long it was going to take, I probably would have acted a little quicker. But, you know, I did have the expectation that the DOJ would have moved perhaps a little quicker than they did. Senator Moss is here, I see, and don't worry, I already covered Bianca and her amazing performance on Saturday. Every bit as good as you suggested to me it might be, and I'm sure very important to all the young reporters in this room right now.
Hi, Barbara Rodriguez with the 19th. With 100 days or so to go, what do you view as the most underreported elections dynamic playing out? And if you're able to answer second part, what is possibly the most concerning? I can recognize that those aren't necessarily the same.
Yeah, I don't, let's see, the most underreported. I don't know what that, well, to me, part of it had to do with, you know, the attorneys that are still out there. I think that that's not talked about nearly enough. You know, I would love to see one or many of you do a, where are they now? The, you know, attorneys that tried to overturn the 2020 election. What have they been up to? But I would say, you know, my concern is very similar. I think because we haven't yet seen vigorous accountability for people who committed crimes during the 2020 election, I think that emboldens people to think that they can commit crimes in the future. And that is a concern to me. And I will say this candidly, I am even more concerned about the 2024 election than I was about the 2020 election for a number of different reasons. One is that I think that for a lot of people, they've lost faith and confidence in our elections and our democracy, not because anything actually went wrong with the election. And of course, you know, we've had in Michigan over 250 audits. We had a Senate committee with, you know, all Republican legislators, save one Democrat, who did a comprehensive review of our election here in Michigan and found that the election was fair and it was accurate and it was safe and it was secure. And we've not found any evidence to counter that, but of course we have Donald Trump and his cohorts who continue to be out there and to spread misinformation and disinformation about that election. And Trump continues to say that he won the election, continues to say he won here in Michigan. Again, 154,000 votes is not nothing. That is a significant number of votes. And again, it's not like he asked for a recount, which is something you can do under Michigan law. He didn't ask for that. But what he did manage to do is to convince people that elections aren't fair and aren't accurate. And that is the part that's so upsetting because, you know, he's already said, like, if he doesn't win, it's because it was stolen. And I mean, that is so frightening. Either I win or it's not fair. And I will say this very candidly, especially now that we see the polls tightening up with Vice President Harris replacing President Biden on the Democratic ticket. My belief is this: if Donald Trump had such a difficult time conceding that he lost to another older white man, he is definitely not going to be okay in the event that he loses a presidential election to a younger black woman. And I am very concerned about what plans he and his allies might have to be disruptive to the 2024 election. And I make no predictions about who will win the election, and it is my job as Attorney General to defend the will of Michigan voters, whatever that might be. And so if Donald Trump receives more votes than our expected nominee, Kamala Harris, God, I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name too. Did I get that right? God, thank God. If that happens and if he wins the election, then I'm going to be just as determined, just as tenacious to defend his win, because that's my job. It's not for me to decide winners and losers. It's for me to defend the will of the people, and that's what I am determined to do. However, I have grave concerns about what Trump and his campaign and his allies will do in the event that Vice President Harris wins, and what he will do to try to disrupt the election as it's ongoing, and what he might try to do following the election. And if you are a person that believes that the events of January 6, 2021, again, that these were tourists who were taking a nice stroll in our nation's capital, I think it's anybody's guess as to what kind of events could possibly take place in the event that Vice President Harris wins. And I think we all have to be on guard for that. We all should be concerned about it, but we all should be very prepared for any set of circumstances to unfold.
Hi, Attorney General. Danny James with MERS. So the Michigan Department of State has seen an 800% increase in Freedom of Information Act requests since 2021, with a large percentage of those concentrated within the Bureau of Elections. This has resulted in a funding increase in this year's budget, but I was wondering, I know you touched on it briefly, but could you tell me a little bit more about the strain on the system that results from some of these frivolous lawsuits that could potentially continue into 2024?
Frivolous lawsuits, and I want to say this, okay? I mean, listen, I'm talking to a bunch of reporters, and I support our Freedom of Information Act laws, but what I do tend to see is sometimes the abuse of it for political reasons. And let me say this about FOIAs, and I know that's not what you asked about. You asked about lawsuits, but when it comes to FOIAs, a lot of this, again, this isn't a situation where you have good faith individuals who are just trying to find out what's happening in our system of elections. A lot of times what we're seeing is an effort to sort of disrupt the working of the office because of the extent of the FOIA requests. And knowing the amount of time and energy and effort and cost and expense that it will take to compile that information, especially when it's done in close conjunction with an election. And I can tell you from the perspective of my department, I've talked to Senator Moss about this many times because, as you know, he has been leading the charge and has for many years to try to expand FOIA to the legislature. And I always say to him, be careful for what you wish for. And it's not because I don't support our FOIA laws. I do. It's because sometimes I see that they're exploited by bad actors who, again, are more interested in sort of disrupting the work of the office than they are just getting to the bottom of something and really finding out the truth. But when it comes to these election lawsuits, my hope is this. I think that legitimate cases, should be filed, right? Cases where you have facts and evidence to support the claims and allegations that you're making in that lawsuit. Absolutely, we shouldn't stop people from filing cases. But, you look at the lawsuits that were filed in the 2020 election, and, anyone reading these complaints would know that there was not a legitimate basis for it. Do you remember when Sidney Powell said that there was, massive irregularities that occurred in Edison County, Michigan? Does anyone know if there is an Edison County, Michigan? Because I can tell you right now, I've been to all 83 counties, and there is not. And all you would have to do is Google it. Like, literally, should there not just be a basic level of investigation that an attorney has to do before making a claim in court? I would argue yes. That you don't claim that there's massive irregularities in Edison County without first researching to find out if there is an Edison County, Michigan. In fact, fun fact, there's not an Edison County anywhere in the United States of America. So you could even be confused with some other county. I leave room for the fact that in Kyrgyzstan or someplace else in Central Asia, there is a Edison County, but not here in the state of Michigan. So my point is that so many of these lawsuits, of course, were just ridiculous on their face and were summarily disposed of by the courts. But there was very little in the way of punitive action taken for those lawsuits. So, for instance, the one lawsuit that resulted in sanctions, the King v. Benson case. First of all, we probably spent 10 times as much money, effort, and resources during the appellate process to appeal the sanctions, and then didn't get reimbursed for that, than we did just for the initial, sanctions that were imposed by Judge Parker. But none of the other cases were there sanctions. And in fact, judges oftentimes are just really, really hesitant to award sanctions on elections cases. But what it does is this, multiple things. First of all, again, just by the filing of it at all, and then even you reporting on it, sometimes people start thinking, well, there must be something to this. Oh my God, something really bad happened. And why would an attorney say all these things unless there was some merit to it in some way, shape, or form? So I think what it does is it colors the perception of the public. And then again, it takes a lot of resources from our department. And we have, multiple attorneys and clerks and legal secretaries that have to be involved in fighting back these cases, case after case after case. And again, you end up in a situation where, there's no, very seldom are there sanctions. There's no disciplinary action taken against these attorneys' licenses. And I would argue, in fact, that it's money-making for these lawyers. These lawyers are making a lot of money by just even filing these cases. They're getting paid so much money that the sanctions really don't even matter. Because why not take the chance that you'll get sanctioned when you know that whatever you're getting paid, far outweighs whatever the sanction amount is. And, and then it costs the state of Michigan, again, a lot of money for us to defend. And not just the state of Michigan, look at all the frivolous cases that were brought against the city of Detroit and all the money that they had to pay lawyers in order to defend that. And so, yeah, it's very concerning. I think the courts need to get really serious about what happens when you file a case that is, completely meritless and vexatious in nature, and that, it should be made clear that those are not going to be tolerated. Legitimate cases, again, based on facts and evidence, at least colorable claims, yes, absolutely. Those cases should be filed, but not the kinds that we've been seeing in recent years.
We're testing the AG schedule a lot here, but we have time for one more.
Yes, Sean Waterman. I'm a freelancer for Compiler, Cyberwatch. I wanted to ask about criminal prosecutions for the election misinformation. I mean, as you know, Jack Bergman's been turned into a martyr by Tucker Carlson and other MAGA Republicans. Does it concern you that by leaning in so hard on some of these prosecutions, you might be, I mean, part of the desired outcome is to shore up confidence in the election system, to make people feel better about it being fairer and more accurate? And I mean, does it concern you at all that by leaning in so hard to some of these prosecutions, you know, are worsening the atmosphere of divisiveness and the you're sort of playing to the concerns that Republicans have about these about elections?
Well, what is the alternative to that? Not enforcing the law, right? Just telling people that they are free to go ahead and to violate election laws and to attempt to undermine our democracy, and that there is no accountability and no repercussions of any kind. You know, I refuse to cave to the Tucker Carlsons of the world, even though, you know, he's talked about me on a handful of occasions that I'm aware of. And believe me, I know when it happens, because that's when I start getting a lot of threats personally. But, you know, I mean, you have to be, first of all, you know, in an office like mine, you have to understand, unfortunately, at this point, that kind of comes with the territory. But that if we are, you know, to look the other way and refuse to aggressively enforce election laws, that's when our democracy is really in trouble. When people believe that they have carte blanche to, you know, disrespect the will of the voters and to violate our election laws, and they can do so without consequence. So, you know, I refuse to bend to that sort of, you know, thinking, and to those that would, you know, continue to spread the disinformation by, again, making these individuals into martyrs. They are not martyrs. They are criminals.
Well, it's not in my DNA to shut down a conversation like this, but the time has come. But I wanted to have you join me in thanking the AG for a great discussion here.
Thank you all for having me. Thank you for the heavy lifting that you've been doing, that I know you're going to continue to doing during this election cycle. And thanks for continuing to spread accurate information, and for holding folks accountable when necessary. So I really appreciate all of your hard work, and thank you for inviting me to be here.